Been a little while since we've been in Genesis. Yeah. So it says, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done. And he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. Okay. Now you should see right away the emphasis there. We think about how foolish it would be to really believe in theistic evolution even, or any kind of aspect of thinking that God is not the one who did creation. And because it's so plain here. God got done and it was finished. And evolution, of course, is an ongoing kind of a thing. And again, it wouldn't fit. So the seventh day is the climatic day. The work is done. Again, it's spoken of differently this day than the other 6 days. There's no creative commands on this day, and God said, such as in verse 3 or 6 or 9 or 11, 14, 20 or 24 or 26. So it is set apart here. Second, this day doesn't have the usual closing statement. Remember how a lot of the days close in their statements? How did it state that it's a day? Remember the end some of the statements when it got done, it says, and it was the blank and the blank, the morning and the evening, which was either the first day or whatever. Uh-oh. Now we got a phone call in church time. Okay. Elaine should know better. Just click it, Judy. Yeah. All right. We didn't say anything about have to have your iPads turned off, just your phones, right? Okay, there you go. Okay. Again, we'll see that this is going to be the only day that God blesses and consecrates or sets apart. And it's interesting that the number of the day is repeated 3 times. Again, the completion statement there in 2:1. Then in verses 2 through 3, we have 4 lines in the Hebrew, which is interesting, that when each of those Hebrew statements are in 7-word statements, and right in the middle of those 7 Hebrew words, it says each having 7 words. Each having 7 words, and the middle phrase in the middle of those 7 words being the seventh day. So there's emphasis put on this seventh day. And so a literal translation would read something like this. So God finished by the seventh day his work which he did, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he did. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because on it he rested from all his work which God created to do. Okay, you get the, of course, more English words, but in the Hebrew it's 7 words, and those first 3 lines of the Hebrew is with the statement, the seventh day, right in the middle. So there's some emphasis being put here. Now, when was the Pentateuch actually written? By the way, who wrote it? Moses, right? Moses wrote it. So a lot of things that we're getting here too, and it has, quite a bit of impact on Israel. And one of the points that's going to be made is that, God created, the same God in the first chapter of Genesis, the stress is on Elohim, the creator God. And then you get into chapter 2, we're going to see Yahweh being starting to use, and it's going to speak of the covenant kind of a God. Okay? And so God is the one who created the earth. God is the one also who redeemed Israel, the same God who did both, being stressed here. And this idea that God is the one who does the work, and he completed his work. Besides, his work is repeated 3 times. He rested, is stated another 2 times. And so it's just really clear. Who is responsible for creation? Again, it is God. Now remember in chapter 1 how it's conveyed that God is the creator? You remember? Just a perspective. It says that he did, but how many times his name is used even in the first chapter? We stress that. So indeed, how, again, people can even get the idea that God is somehow sort of started process and just sort of lets it go, and that just is not what's being conveyed in the first chapter or so of Genesis. Now, is the creation complete according to this section? That's what's stressed, isn't it? It's finished. It's finished. So the creation work is finished. So his providential work will continue and so on. But as far as the creation, and remember he stated when he was done after 6 days that it was not only good, but it was very good. Okay, it's very good. So again, the seventh day is going to mark it out as this unique creation completed totally by God. Again, that argues clearly against evolution. Another reason for why the seventh day is unique, again, is this concept that God rested. You know, when you expend your energy like you do and you make this vast universe, by 6 days later, you'd be pretty wiped out, wouldn't you? That's probably not what it's teaching, is it? Okay. So we have to understand, what does it mean when the word rested is used? It basically saying is God ceased from his work because it was completed. All right. Now, this, just to convey that that's really the case, look at Isaiah 40. Isaiah 40, verse 28. It wasn't that God was tired and he needed to take a nap, right? It wasn't anything like that. He didn't need a Sabbath rest like we do. Okay, sometimes we need a rest on Sundays or whatever day. God doesn't need to sleep. Would someone like to read Isaiah 40, verse 28? Yeah, Marty?
Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable.
Okay. And in his creation, he never started to get worn out or faint or anything like that. It had nothing to do with that. Okay, let's look back at Psalms 121, verse 4 as well. Psalms 121, verse 4. Let's see. I don't know if that's the right one. Oh, yeah, there it is. Yes, who would like to read that verse? Tom? Okay, he doesn't need to sleep. Now, does that have any practical implications even for us? Yes, right? Great, huh? You can lay down and go to sleep tonight and not worry about a thing, right? Because somebody's not going to sleep tonight, right? God is, again, very much never needing rest, sleep, so on. So the stress is going to be on the idea that he ceased from his work. So there's a concept here not only of that we see this idea, we'll talk about a little bit of rest and what he will do for man, but we'll see how it switches over. Now the concept of a name or a noun, I should say, that will come from this word for rest, it's the Hebrew word Shabbat, will be later transliterated as Sabbath. That's where we get the concept of Sabbath. And so it's what translates the word for rested, the Sabbath. So another thing that's unique about this day, again, is that God blessed it. Okay, in this particular day, he says here in Genesis that he blessed the day and he sanctified it. Now, when God sanctifies it, what's being conveyed when we have this concept of God sanctifying? Do you know what the word behind, we use like holy, sanctification, consecration, what? It belongs, good, Beth. What? Chosen? Yeah, I mean, it's something that he has truly set apart for himself, okay? It's distinct. So we are made to be his holy people, but by that we are his, to be used by him for his purposes, right? We're set apart, uniquely set apart for him. So he sanctified it, he blessed it, he set it apart. Again, to commemorate, you might say, a very satisfactory kind of way in which God is saying, this great work that I have done, it's completed, it's very good, commemorate, and it's that kind of an idea. So we end up with, like in Psalm 19, 1 and 2, the heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament showeth his handiwork. It's his work. But the seventh day was to commemorate in his mind. Now, is there any indication at this point in Genesis that we know where now God gives some kind of command about this day in relationship to man? Are we commanded at this point? Is there any indication at this point yet in Scripture that we're supposed to keep a Sabbath because God kept the Sabbath? Okay? It's not, in fact, it's not, okay? In fact, the first time that we will see it used this way is not until Exodus 16. The first time you actually see that. Now, even though there's this principle, and we understand how God created us, and it's great to have a work week, and God will teach the Israelites about the day of rest and so on. We'll talk about that. But there's no indication that we can tell in Genesis that Sabbath was something that they observed as man, okay? Look at Exodus 16, 23. Exodus 16. 23 through 26. Would someone like to read that text? Exodus 16, 23. Okay, yes, Heather.
He said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake, and boil what you will boil, and all that is left lay aside to be kept till the morning." So they laid it aside till the morning, as Moses commanded them, and it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. And Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is the Sabbath to the Lord, and today you will not find it in the field.
Oh.
6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is the Sabbath, there will be none."
All right. Okay, now do you know the context of this? What is it that they had just got as far as provision from God? Manna, okay, yeah, which is just literally the Hebrew, it just means, what is it? Okay, what do we call this stuff? All right? And some of the people, he told them, gather just what you need for the day. And so right away, he had some people that decided to gather some more than just that one day. And it had worms and it did stink, okay? So that's why there's this statement at this point that when it comes to the seventh day, you won't have to worry about that taking place. I'll make sure that it's okay and it's fine for the next day as well, okay? But on this day, and again, this is the very first time since Genesis chapter 2, 1 through 3, where it's used in the sense of God being satisfied with that day and setting this kind of principle up, that we see it actually, you might say, people being responsible for observing or keeping it. Okay, it's the first time we see it, okay? Now, people have tried to argue that because it's in Genesis 2, that people kept it up and through then and all that, but there's no indication of that, okay? There is no indication of that. So there has to be other premises. When we start looking at what Sabbath is and so on, what kind of principles we carry over even for us today, if there's any principles or not that we should be following. Where else then do we find, after this, the Sabbath for Israel? Why does it seem to become important for it? Where would you say is probably the strongest statement? Yeah, Ben. Yeah, it's which one is it? Close to the ones, number 4, that's right. So you have the ones about God. You come down, in fact, it's interesting that the fourth one is sort of like that one that's really right. It's almost like the transition between the ones that are about God and the ones about man. So it's right there in the transition. But it's interesting. And let's look at that. It's in Exodus 20, then 8 through 11. Would someone like to read that, 28 through 11? Okay, yes, Katie.
Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy.
Okay, again, here it is found right in the Ten Commandments, okay? Now, a lot of the parts of it, though, are ceremonial, but I just say it's found right here in the Ten Commandments. Who truly, and this principle of interpretation, again, who is originally the ones who received the Ten Commandments? Who are the ones who are responsible for the Ten Commandments? Again, it's the Jewish people, the covenant people that he's covenanted with, that he gives them the Ten Commandments, right? And it's interesting that in both in 16 and here, when he comes to the end, he gives us the reason why they should do this. And he refers back to Genesis. That's what took place, therefore you should do this, right? Okay. But again, just to show you the context here, it is given to the Jewish people. Oh. Again, when you think of from everything else you probably know from the Old Testament, what do you believe God intended for the Jewish people to do why was it important? What kind of aspects do you think the Sabbath meant to the Jews? What do you think God wanted the Jews to think of the Sabbath? Just put all your biblical thinking together here. What did he want them doing with that day? Okay, I would say, yeah, that would be good. He would worship him, right? What were they actually, yeah, Ben?
Setting themselves apart.
Yeah, setting themselves apart for him. As a nation, they were going to demonstrate that to the whole world. They were setting themselves, and they would be stopping. They would have this pattern that I don't know if the rest of the world, what kind of way they did things. We know later that France tried a 10-day system, but we're not sure how before that, people were actually, what they were doing with weeks. I don't know if that pattern was followed for sure or not. But we know that when God dealt with Israel, he established that clearly for them. And the point was being to follow the pattern that God had and to be thinking about God, again, created everything, and God was the one who was responsible for creating them as a nation, okay? A commemoration. Now, was there any good benefit from that for the people? Yes, they were. Yeah, yes. Now, is the Sabbath, when we get looking at the Jewish situation, is it just for the people? No, it's not, is it? What kind of things did start to develop with this whole idea of Sabbath? Because there's Sabbath, like 7 days, there'll be 7 other kind of patterns throughout the Old Testament too. And there's certain things that are happening with not only people, but what else? Animals, anything else? Land as well, right? Okay. So God is giving this pattern to some of these things, okay? But again, we see right up front here that this idea of Sabbath is something that is given to the Jewish people. Okay, for them especially to be observing, and it's going to make a statement. And for them to recognize in this pattern their existence and that he is the creator. Now, we need to look at another passage. Look at Exodus 31. Exodus 31. Now, this is a longer passage. Anybody wants to take on this? Verses 12 through 18. Would someone like to read this passage? Yeah, Derek?
And the Lord said to Moses, "You are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all, you should keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. You shall keep the Sabbath, because it is holy for you. everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. Therefore the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout their generations as a covenant forever. It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel that in 6 days the Lord had made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed.
Okay, let's move through it now a little slow and just look at some of the things. First of all, what do you notice when we first start to read why he wants him to do it, or what is what is the purpose for, what does he call this Sabbath as far as for the Jewish people and him? It's a sign of what? Huh?
You may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you.
Yeah, it's a sign that there's this covenant special between him and the people of Israel, that they are set apart as his people, right? That's the idea, right? This Sabbath is going to be a sign that Israel, you're a unique people, right? To me, you're my people. So again, this will be a distinct thing that the Israelites will always end up doing. They will cease work, and on that Sabbath, they will not be working, okay? But I want you to see that, first of all, it's a sign, right? And we go on. The signs between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know what? That it's I who sanctify you. It's I the one who's done this. Creation, who did creation? God did creation. Okay? Sabbath was to mark that. I completed this. This is a work of mine. Okay? Sabbath. Jewish people, you're my nation. I've set you apart from me. I want you to know that it's me who did it. So you come to the seventh day, I want you to be very aware of that, okay? That you're a unique people now and that you're observing this, okay? You must keep it because it is holy for you. You need to see who this is really stressed to. It's his covenant people, the Israelites. Now, is it pretty serious that they keep the Sabbath? What's the penalty for not keeping the Sabbath? Death. That's pretty serious, right? I mean, how seriously, if you're a Jew, should you take the Sabbath? Probably pretty seriously, right? Right? Do we know from the Old Testament whether there's any examples of people who thought they would test that out? Were there any ever found breaking the Sabbath that they took out and stoned? Yeah, Judy?
They threatened Jesus with that.
Well, they did threaten Jesus with that. But I believe even in the Old Testament, I've been just reading through this, I believe there is a count or two where they did, yeah, right?
There is a man collecting sticks in the woods.
Okay, good. And so they said, a little slap on the wrist and said, don't do it again? Is that what they did? They stoned him to death, right? That's what they did, didn't they? Good. So yeah, it was very serious. Okay? We need to catch that. Okay, so some of the things we're seeing here right away, again, in Genesis, this is quite a statement that God completed his work of creation. But it really comes down to Israel, where he really develops this with them as a sign between them and himself, as a sign, a mark that they are God's people. Are there any signs at all that we as believers are his people? Our fruit, okay. Anything else that you would say that, how do people know that we are his people? Do you remember any statements? By the love we have for one another, right? That's one of them, right? That's a mark, right? That's an indicator. They'll know you're mine by the way you love one another, right? Okay, there's various ways. Our public proclamation through, like baptism, or and then we would confess with our mouth, but public professions, different things like that. Yes, okay. Okay, just to bring that out. Now, to show you that it's also connected to the redemption, look at Deuteronomy 5. Deuteronomy 5. Deuteronomy 5. 12. Twelve through 15. Would someone like to read this text? Yes, Cindy? Okay.
Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, or your male servant or your female servant, or your ox or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day.
Okay, now in reading this one, did you notice another reason for why they should observe it?
A slave in the land of Egypt.
They were a slave, and also what? They were a slave, and so what would we say? We were. So what did he do for them? What would we call that? He basically redeemed them. He delivered them, right? He delivered them from that. So again, the Sabbath was going to be another indication. We've been coming around this in different ways. The covenant with them. They're his people uniquely. This is a mark, a sign. But it's also a sign now of redemption, in a sense, or deliverance. They are a nation because he delivered it. He kept the promises to their Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but again, this indication is of what he's done now in delivering them from bondage. Okay? So that's there as well. So this is truly unique to Israel. Okay? We need to see that. Okay? But people who come into Israel, animals, so on, they're to observe it as well. Okay? Now, did the Israelites understand or appreciate the goodness in what God had given them within a Sabbath? What do you think? Not always. Not always. In fact, I just read in my devotions this morning in Deuteronomy, the blessings and the curse, and all that would come upon Israel if they failed to do as he said, and part of it has to do with this, and the great judgment that would come upon them. Now, Israel had a particular captivity that lasted quite a few years that some believe, because of passages like in Ezekiel, that the reason it was that amount of years was because they had not kept the Sabbath as far as the land was concerned, which was the 70-year captivity that God brought that judgment, Babylon, upon them, which is interesting, again. So between God and Israel, this is very serious affront, okay? And when you go through the Old Testament, there's much said about the Sabbath. Sabbath is a lot of places because truly it was unique to Israel, okay? I keep saying that, but it's true. Now, when we get to the New Testament, and Beth has already alluded to some of this, how did Jesus approach the Sabbath? Now, this is, to think here. Now, let's look at a couple passages. Let's go to Mark 2, 23. Let's look at some more passages then. Look at Mark 2, 23 through 28. Would someone like to read this text? Kaylee, got it?
One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of
Abiathar.
the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath."
Okay, there's a lot here, okay? But here, So we have to get a real understanding of what's going on here. First of all, let's see, how do I want to bring this out without just telling you answers? Did Jesus have a lot of run-ins with the religious leaders about his activity on the Sabbath? Yes. There's lots of accounts of that, right? Healing situations, right? Somebody then picking up their mat. I mean, terrible, you just got, you're able to walk down, you pick your mat up, and say, well, how dare you, carry your mat, right? So Jesus is dealing with the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees, right away, they notice that his disciples are doing something. What are they doing? Are they out there laboriously out gathering a whole bunch of grain for them to put away in their barns and so forth?
They could pick it, but they couldn't rub it between their hands because that was grinding. And grinding is a job.
Okay. Okay, can you give me the Old Testament verse for that one? You can,
Made up the rules.
right. All right. Now, why do you suppose, again, I've probably said this before, but why did the religious leaders, why did they start to give such strict kind of standards about the Sabbath?
When they got back from Babylon,
Okay.
they were saying, we better not do this again. So therefore, we're going to put extra rules or extra fences around the commandments.
Okay.
So you can't possibly break them. So then they made the rules more important than the commandments.
Yeah. They wanted to, it's like you don't want your kids to play in the road, so you put a fence way back from the road so they can't even get close to it. They thought if they made a lot of strictures, they could keep the people from ever getting to the one that would really break the Sabbath. It wouldn't even come close to that, okay? That was their intent. The problem was, as they started to develop all these extra rules, they turned the Sabbath into something it was not supposed to be, okay? And even, so, what was God's intent? I mean, think about it. What was God's intent for the Sabbath for the Jewish people? He just wanted to crimp their style. He just wanted to make it hard on them. He just wanted them to, what was his purpose on the Sabbath? Paul?
There were two things, really. The main one was to set aside one day as a holy day to worship the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
The other was rest.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And,
Did you enjoy the one's family?
huh?
Did you enjoy one's family? He didn't want people celebrating the Sabbath or his feast with long faces. He wanted them
Should have been
to
some,
enjoy their family. Enjoy
yeah. Now, yeah, let's follow God's example. What do you think God's example really is from Genesis 2:1 through 3? How did he view the Sabbath when it came to his work?
He was happy with it.
He was delighted, wasn't he? It's very good. It's commemorating something that is done and done well and commemorating that. How do you think God wants us to think about our work? Huh?
The same.
Same, yeah, to be satisfied with that. And for us, God can get all the glory for what he has done, and we can be thankful for God giving us the health or the provision through the work, through the week, and now we can rest and look at the provision God has made for us. Rejoice in that, right? I mean, that's really what it was to be. And to then give praise to God for God's provision, God's given you the ability, just this idea of the blessing of life. Good. Right? So why did Jesus have so many, why do you suppose Jesus, even it's amazing how much of the New Testament deals with all these kind of things taking place on the Sabbath. Why is God communicating? What is God communicating through those passages about Jesus doing all these things on the Sabbath? Let's look at another one. Look at Luke 14. Luke 14, 1 through 6. And someone ready to read that one? Okay, Marty?
One Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of the ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully. And behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus responded to the lawyers and the Pharisees, saying, Is it lawful to heal on a Sabbath or not? They remained silent. And he took them and healed them and sent him away. And he said to them, Which of you, having a son or an ox, is not fallen into a well on Sabbath day, will not immediately pull him out? And they could not reply to these things.
Okay, so what's Jesus' point? What is, again, let's get a hold of what we've so far got the Sabbath, and what's he really direct? What's he hitting here?
We care more about rules than each other.
Somewhat, yeah. Their rules, right? Their rules. I mean, to break God's law is death. I mean, that's serious stuff. But they went beyond that. Paul?
He intended the Sabbath to be something good, like it was in the beginning. Good for us and something to make us happy and joyful. Not to be onerous, not to be a set of rules that we had to follow where we couldn't do things.
Yeah. Now, how does this hit us when it comes to other things that God puts on us? Now, whatever we'll go on here and talk about Sabbath, and whatever we believe about how we should observe it, or anything about it at all, but about all the things that God has for us. You know, it speaks to how do we view what he brings to us in our life. I mean, in his commands of Scripture. How do we look at his commands? How do we view having to do the things that we do? Do we look at them like, oh, I don't want to do that. I guess I'll go put my time in at church today, or whatever. You know what I'm saying? My devotional life. Oh, I gotta mark it off the day, get it done, right? Think about us in the flesh, okay? Just think about, think about the attitude he wants us to have when it comes to those things that he has for us, and what his real purposes are in even giving us those things in the first place. That if we're not getting it right, we're misunderstanding things. We don't have it right. We're not appreciating the Word. We're not appreciating the relationship with him. We're not appreciating those kind of things the right way, right? That's really what this is speaking to as well. And Jesus does all these good things on the Sabbath, and he reminds them, says, even, here's a person, I've just healed this person. I mean, isn't there an exception for taking care of the disciples? Isn't there an exception? What's the principle behind all this? Were they in some way in spirit breaking the Sabbath? No. The way God had designed it? No. And Jesus wasn't either. In fact, he said something else about himself. God made the Sabbath for man first, right? Right? And then he said something else. This is what the Jews really had a problem with too. He said he was what of the Sabbath? He's Lord of the Sabbath. And they had a problem with him being God, right? So again, when we think about this, now, although we find it in the Ten Commandments, which I really believe is centerpiece to the Jewish covenant and relationship, and I don't believe that we follow the Ten Commandments exactly like the Jews do in every regard. I think there is in fact, I think the fourth commandment is one of the test things in the New Testament. You take everything else, so think about it. You go down all the ones. Now, if I thought the Sabbath was really for us, I would have a hard time with a couple other passages in the New Testament. Now, let's go to a couple of them, first of all, that we don't follow strictly a seventh day or Sabbath kind of regulation in the church. Let's look at a couple. Look at Colossians 2, 16 and 17. it's never made then, because I believe something takes place under the new covenant. I think there's some changes under the new covenant. We enter into a different kind of rest. And it's not to say that we still don't need to worship God and so on, that still needs to be a principle of our life and so on. But for us to, that we would be under the Jewish concept and this big stress that is between the Jews and God in a covenant relationship. Look at Colossians 2, and someone would like to read that, 16 and 17. Yeah, Heather.
Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath,
Okay. Go ahead, yeah, sorry.
for a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to God.
Okay. Now, these pointed to something that we would have in Christ, okay? It's interesting that he mentions Sabbath. Now, we talked about the Seventh-day Adventists, my relatives, they're Seventh-day Baptists, and so on. And they still try to hold to the Sabbath for Christians. However, when I come to texts like this, and I read this carefully, it says we're not to, how would God have said that differently if it was for us? Those people who are saying the Sabbath is not, you're not to observe, they're wrong. They need to keep the Sabbath yet, right? Wouldn't it be something more like that? Right? Let's look at another passage like that. Look at Romans 14, 5 and 6a. Romans 14, 5 and 6a. Now again, this is Gentiles and Jews, and I think this is why there's a little bit of a problem here in the church and how they should view each other. Okay, and this is a context of the weak and stronger brother. But would someone like to read 14, 5 through 6, the first part of 6 there? Yeah, go ahead, Kaylee. Yeah.
One person esteems one day as better than another, and another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord.
Okay. You can finish it, and then we'll see what the context is.
The one who eats, eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains, abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God.
Okay. In the context again, it's not like we come under the new covenant and now God is continuing to stress this need for us to observe strictly a Sabbath. All right? So, and there seems to be this difficulty between some of the believers because of how, if you have Jewish believers now and they're used to always following the Sabbath, I can't even imagine trying to leave a pattern like that if that's the way you were always raised and that's the way you should communicate to God and so on. And probably it would not be wrong for you to continue that as a Jewish person in one sense. But there's other things stressed in the New Testament as well about the rest that we have and some other things that take place. Now, I'll just ask you this. Why do we worship normally on Sunday and not on Saturday? Yeah, Ben?
Celebration of the resurrection.
Okay, good. Yes. The first day of the week. Now just think about that. The 8th day becomes the first day of the resurrection, the new creation, starting into this whole new thing that God is creating new. Now, it's interesting in Genesis chapter 2, 1 through 3, that it doesn't end like the other days. It's almost like it's open-ended. And that when everything was first created, there was truly rest between God and his people. God commemorates it. We're in a state of peace and rest and good things going into the Garden of Eden, the way he designed it. You come to the new creation, first day of creation, you have the first resurrection of Christ, you have all that. You have the church born on the day of Pentecost as well, which is also a Sunday, okay? You have all these new things taking place. And so we as believers, we could go to 1 Corinthians 16, we could go to John 20, verse 1, and in Revelation 1:10, it talks about the day of the Lord, probably refers that John saw his vision as well, and the day of the Lord probably refers to that as well. And so there's a reason why we shifted to Sunday over Saturday. I hope what you're seeing tonight is, indeed, it was a very strong relationship of the Sabbath concept with the Jewish people, okay? It goes back to it, and they went, and God pulled them back to the creation stuff, principle there, how he set that up. And then we begin to develop this. Now, one other passage we won't spend a lot of time in tonight, but just to mention it. And let's just go there and I'll read a couple verses. Hebrews 4. Now, Hebrews is written to Jewish believers again, and that are struggling because they no longer need to follow the old pattern under the old covenant. They can follow now the new covenant in Christ and a better way and so on. They don't need to go back and do sacrifices, etc. They don't have to go back and observe things like the Jewish people. And that all seems bigger to them. That was such a strong witness to them. And they're, in fact, because they're not, they get basically persecuted from other Jewish people for not being true to the Jewish way. So, in the midst of this, as he's dealing with them, telling them they need to follow Christ and believe Christ. Notice, I'll read this in the first part here. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them because they were not united by faith with those who listened. And he's referring back to a psalm, I think it's 95 in the Old Testament, about the Jewish people who did not trust God and worship God the right way. They didn't believe God. And because they didn't believe God, they never entered into the rest that God wanted them to have, in a spiritual sense, okay? Now, believers under the new covenant, we have entered into a spiritual rest, okay? And we have this eternal rest. And he's just challenging there. You need to go on in faith and experience the blessing of being eternally secure in God and having that kind of permanent rest. For we who have believed, enter that rest. As it is said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest, although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. And God is the one who's provided for everything, creation, redemption, and the way through Christ which would give us permanent spiritual rest in the new creation of the new covenant. He's done all that. And we as believers now testify to that new rest, spiritual rest that we have. And I don't believe it's bound up necessarily in a day. Now, is there any principles, though, that you would think we should carry on? I don't believe we should go back to the Jewish concept of the way they looked at the Sabbath, per se, or even maybe all the strictures of the Sabbath like they had. But what principles do you think we would still want to pull that we still do? There's some principles that we still do. And again, we don't, I don't set up here and we don't get together the leadership and say, for our congregation, this is the way we observe the Sabbath or Sunday. And if we don't observe Sunday right, you're out of fellowship because you're not doing those kind of things just exactly right. You might take a nap on Sunday and somebody might not. You might take a trip. You might walk too far. We don't do that kind of thing. In fact, that was more of the man kind of a center kind of thing. But what kind of good things would you think God would want us to be careful about on how we practice some of these things?
Well, there should be a regularly scheduled, fairly frequent time of corporate worship.
Okay, good. So there should be time, and we've set that up and it makes sense as a church to have, again, a regular time of worship of God, right? Kaylee?
Singing praises together.
Yeah, singing together. We'd have to do that to basically fulfill Ephesians chapter 5. Singing to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs and so on, yes. The regular assembling of ourselves together to do that, right? Now, does it make sense for us to meet on Sunday?
Well, absolutely.
Yeah. Would you like to, I had the wedding for my grandson on a Thursday. That's normally not, and he didn't have as many people there either because of it. That's just not, because, why? Why practically doesn't it make sense? I mean, beyond we have good reason to do it on a Sunday, right? Ben?
With what we've read tonight, we've read a lot about rest being associated with the Sabbath.
Yeah.
But especially Old Testament, is there a connection to corporate worship on the Sabbath?
I don't know if they really had. There would have been sacrifices brought sometimes, things like that, but I don't think they had. Originally, I think it would have been more families recognizing the day than it probably would have been, my thinking and culturally probably.
So, biblically, is there much association with corporate worship on being connected to?
To Sabbath? I don't know if there is. We commemorate, again, the resurrection, and we have other things we have to do, yeah.
You have to think of the practical side of it again. In those days, they worked hard to live, just to stay alive.
Right,
They didn't take a weekend off.
yeah,
About as much as they could get off or take off or afford to take off would be a day. And so combining rest with worship would be just a natural, practical way to go about it.
yeah. Now, how do people today, you might say, convey publicly that God doesn't mean a whole lot to them? Normally, what's their pattern? They go golfing on Sunday, or they do something else, or they don't mind if they work every day of the week. They don't take any time off for God. They don't stop ever. They just keep, farmers or whatever. They don't even try to work it in. It might be one thing. There's an emergency or something that takes place. We all have those kind of situations where it's an exception. It's not like the sword of the Lord is hanging over you if you don't technically get there because something comes up. But there's a spiritual understanding here about this, isn't there? A discernment about how we handle this. Judy?
Well, to sort of go back to Ben's question, I'm thinking of after the temple was destroyed and Israelis came back into the land, Jewish people, they developed this system of
The synagogue, right?
the synagogue.
Right.
And they did meet together in the synagogue.
Yeah, so that definitely had an influence on what we think of as far as church. That made a,
Say it's corporate
yeah,
worship.
yeah, that did happen. You're right.
Did have no longer had a sacrifice,
Yeah,
but they did have corporate meeting.
right. What was, and again, for the Jewish people, for the Jewish men especially, wasn't there like three particular, like Passover, Tabernacle, and another one that they were supposed to come from wherever to come to that, right? Those were special times that they were supposed to come together as a nation and worship God, right? Okay. And even then, you think about these kind of things, it's like, there were special times then for different things to take place as well, okay? And a lot of them are wrapped around from Sabbath to Sabbath or whatever, right? And so they not only got their day off, but sometimes they got a week off, or they got, different times where they had breaks. They got a vacation. Some of it was to come and, focus on the Lord too, but yeah. So anyway, what I hope we see from this is, I've never been one to say, you can't do that activity on a Sunday but when it comes to focusing on, my family needs to be able to come and focus on Sunday, on worshiping the Lord and those kind of things, then each of us need to practically think that through. How do you prepare yourself, right? And so on. And that when we're there, that we especially can ask the Lord to help us keep our focus where it should be. Now, there's a real test on that tonight for me, even. I have a little interest in a football team, right? So, and having watched the Lions for 50, 60 years, it's not very often when they actually win something. So it's like, well, I hope they win, but I don't even know what happened. But anyway, so, and I think that's the kind of challenge that comes. Those kind of things, I remember one time I had a service also on a Sunday night, and it was I think it was 84 with the Tigers. Get the right one. Yeah, it would have been 84. No, not 84. But it was another time when they got to play. Yeah, anyway, Gibson hit a home run, but I was at church preaching, I remember, or something like that. I was involved in the ministry. And being a baseball player and loving the Tigers, it was like, oh, this is one thing I would like to see, And yet, responsibility, so, priorities, right? And so you learn to handle those things, right, in the right way and give God the right kind of position. Some people are, you could be going fishing all the time or hunting all the time or whatever, but that's, a cottage every weekend, always missing church, never able to serve the Lord. There's all kinds of ways you could apply this. You got to be really careful that we look at what are the priorities we have for God. Are we communicating to people that God is really number one in our lives, right? Would do something, Katie?
I just wondered if the Jewish, so the Jewish people now, like they're still, because they have that covenant with the Lord, are they still supposed to keep that Sabbath like they did in the Old Testament?
I don't believe so. I don't believe the Jewish believer necessarily has to do that anymore because they, I believe, are also under that new covenant. But I think the transition here in the New Testament, because those people were raised under that they did struggle with a break from that. And it seems like from what we read in Romans and those kind of passages that God didn't want the Gentiles to come out too hard on the Jewish people who were struggling with that.
I thought one of the verses in the beginning, though, that we were reading said that this is my covenant.
With the people of Israel, right?
Yeah, forever.
Forever? Yeah.
So if that, to me, would think that they would have to keep that forever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Many Messianic Jews do keep.
They keep the Sabbath. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
They feel
It's very possible they do.
Gentiles didn't have to become Jewish to become Christians. Neither do Jews. Messianic Jews have to become Gentiles.
Yeah. Okay. But you could see what could happen in the New Testament period if the Gentiles would pretty much have their church services on Sunday, right? And so it might be hard for them to get and keep a Sabbath exactly and then feel bad about not keeping the Sabbath exactly right? I think there's little adjustments there that would,
Many of the church services in the New Testament, there was going out of the Sabbath, which would be Saturday night.
True,
The first day of the week.
true.
So
Yeah, that's true.
morphed into the daytime rather than night.
Yeah.
And there are Messianic Jews that have worship on Sunday.
Yeah, okay. And Romans, and I think Colossians would give, at least at this time period, that would give that kind of option, yeah, for them, yeah. Whenever we deal with an issue like this, to somehow come to a balance and understanding, we have to know all of Scripture again. Like, go through all these passages and sort of, who is it, context. Who is it applying to? What's it saying directly? What is the emphasis God gives on these things? What is the thing he's trying to convey? How does that apply to us today? All right. Better quit there tonight. Yeah.
One of the miracles that God has wrought, he made from two people, the Jews and the Gentiles.
Gentiles.
He made them into one people for himself.
Yeah. Well, let's pray, and then we'll have a break about 5 minutes or so, and we'll have hopefully a short business meeting here. I think we got enough. Let's pray. Father, grateful for your word. Help us to be real careful, discerning with it, to study it properly, to apply it properly. Lord, to be careful with all these things. Lord, we're grateful for all you've done for us. And again, for those that we prayed for again today, those with physical needs, pray that you'll continue to be with them, that they will be able to handle, again, the trial that they are under, and that we'll continue to support them in prayer and in other ways, practical ways, Lord, that would encourage them.